Rev up your engines! Today I'm going to tell you the truth about GM's plan to lay off a bunch of workers and to shut down a bunch of American factories. Well, if you remember, a few years back they got the big bailout because they say they were going bankrupt, so the government gave them a bunch of money and to save American jobs, and now they're just leaving anyways. So what's the truth behind what's really happening? Now, I've read and watched a bunch of these pundits, the supposed experts, saying, oh, market forces, you have to follow the market forces, blah, blah, blah. But here's the truth. And to understand it, you need to learn a little about history. Now, I learned to drive on a Chevrolet Biscayne. It's kind of like an Impala. Big monster American car. Back in the 1960s when they made solid cars that everybody all over the world knew, hey, they're good cars, they lasted a long time. Back then, everybody said, oh, the Japanese cars, little piles of junk, what are they making? Well, guess what? They kept making better and better and better cars as time went on from Japan. While the quality of the American cars started going down and down and down. To give you an example, the Impala used to be a great car. 60s, everybody wanted an Impala. They were very popular cars. They're pretty well built. They could last a really long time. But not so recently. The Impala is one of the models that they're going to stop making. Basically, they didn't build them all that well. I had customers with them, and every single person that owned one, when they finally got rid of it, said, I'll never buy another one of those pieces of junk. I had more problems with the transmissions and the engines. And the old ones didn't used to have very many problems. So the supposed experts that talk about market forces is forcing them to shut down these factories and lay off people. That's basically a lot of hoo-ha. Basically, they were just making the cars poorly, and they were making models that people didn't want, like the Chevy Cruze, which not only was it a model that people didn't really want, it was really poorly made. I have a customer with one. He's been through 3 automatic transmissions that went out completely in the first 75,000 miles of driving that car. It's just ridiculous. And look at another one of their failures that they're not going to make anymore. The Chevy Volt. Hey, they kind of tried to compete with the Toyota Prius, and they failed massively. The cars were garbage compared to what Toyota was putting out. So they can talk about market forces all they want. A lot of the problem is, they were making vehicles that were either poorly made or people didn't want to buy them because they didn't like the way they looked or the way they handled. And unlike the Japanese, like say a Toyota Corolla, they start out with a basic car and they keep improving it over decades. GM was like, oh, well, that model didn't work. We'll scrap that one. We'll try something else. It's much better to build something and perfect it over time than to just say, oh, that didn't work. Well, let's take a stab at something else and see if that worked. Some of their ideas are, oh, we'll go to just the bigger vehicles, SUVs, trucks and stuff that make a lot of money. We'll talk about short-sightedness again. Now, just because gas is cheap, they think, oh, we'll sell these giant vehicles to everybody and make a bunch of money. Well, guess what, people? Gasoline is a limited commodity. The price is only going to go up, and it'll probably happen relatively soon. And then all those big cars, people are going to be, well, we're not going to drive those anymore, and they'll be in a bigger pickle than they're in now. And as far as I'm concerned, GM's idea of shutting these factories down in the United States and laying off all these Americans, hey, that has to do more with them making a profit in China, not the United States. Realize that for the last data I could find, the Chinese produced 24.5 million cars. And at that same time period, the United States produced 4.1 million cars. Quite a difference. And as for GM itself, GM sells 70% more cars in China than they do in the United States. And these cars are all made in China. So if things continue along this pace, I wouldn't be surprised at all that if someone in the United States decides they're going to buy a GM car in the near future, that baby's going to be made in China, not the United States. Even though we taxpayers bailed out GM the last time, their big thank you is, bye. We'll see you in China. Gee, they didn't seem to say, oh, the market's forcing them to do that when they took all that taxpayer money. You know, they're giving these promises about American jobs and stuff. But then, as soon as they see a way to make their cars in China, sell them in China, and probably import those Chinese ones over to the United States, hey, Those guys are basically laughing at the average American. It's bad enough that they were making cars that had faulty ignition switches, and then they cheated and changed the parts numbers, so they think, oh, people aren't going to figure out that we made these bad ignition switches, that some people got killed in wrecks because the car stopped running. They're not interested in telling the truth about the problems that they have, but taking taxpayers' dollars and then shutting the factories down years later anyways and moving all the stuff to China. Hey, all I gotta say is, you can vote with your dollars. Don't buy their products. Nobody's gonna force you to buy one of their products, at least not yet. Hey, take Toyota for an example. They make a bunch of them in the United States, and they have for decades. You might end up driving a Japanese car around that's made in the United States, where if you buy a GM, it's going to be a Chinese-made car. The world's upside down on that one. So it's really a double-edged sword when you think about why GM is laying off all these workers and closing all these factories down. They've often made poorly designed and built cars that didn't last, so their base, that used to be, oh, when I was a kid, people say, oh, I buy a new GM car every 3-4 years. And that base is radically eroded, and then they want to make them cheaper. So they're going to move all their production to China, where they can make them cheaper. Now, the Chinese factories are all modernized, so they have less labor they have to deal with. But from what I read about them, they have really good quality. For example, Buicks are like the real popular car for the upper level management guys to ride around in a Buick in China. Kind of like it used to be in the 50s and 60s in the United States. A little time warp there. So basically, the real problem is greed. They want to make their cars cheaper so they can make more profit, and eventually they want to make the most profit by building their cars somewhere else where they can make them cheaper and in the modern factories more efficiently than in the old factories in the United States. My hometown, Niagara Falls, had the same fate itself. When I was young, hey, factories were everywhere building all kinds of stuff, but they were old factories. First they moved the factories down to Mexico, then they even moved them further to the east, because it was even cheaper there than it was in Mexico. So if you think about it as a career, hey, you probably wouldn't want to get involved in either building cars in the United States or working for the company that builds them, because you'll find that your job will probably vaporize in the near future. So if you never want to miss another one of my new car repair videos, remember to ring that bell.